As he was passing by, that's Jesus, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," Jesus said. "This came about so that God's works might be displayed in him. We must do good works of him who sent me while it is the day, because the night is coming when no one can work. And as long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." After he said these things, he spit on the ground and made some mud from the saliva and spread the mud on his eyes. "Go," he told him, "wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. So he left, washed, and came back seeing. His neighbours and those who had seen him before as a beggar said, "Isn't this the one who used to sit begging?" And some said, "He is the one," and others were saying, "No, but he does look like him." He kept saying, "I am the one." So they asked him, "Then how are your eyes been opened?" He answered, "The man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and told me, go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and I received my sight." "Where is he?" they asked. "I do not know," he said. They brought the man who used to be blind to the Pharisees. The day that Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes was the Sabbath. Then the Pharisees asked him again how he received his sight. "He put mud on my eyes," he told them. "I washed and I can see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man cannot be from God because he does not keep the Sabbath." But others were saying, "How can a sinful man perform such things?" And there was division among them. Again they said to the blind man, What do you say about him since he opened your eyes?" "He is a prophet," he said. The Jews did not believe this about him, that he was blind and received his sight, until they summoned his parents of the one who had received his sight. And they asked him, "Is this your son, the one you say was born blind? How does he see?" "We know that this is our son and that he was born blind," his parents answered. "But we don't know how he sees, and we don't know who has opened his eyes. Ask him, he is of age. He will speak for himself." His parents said these things because they were afraid of the Jews, since the Jews had already agreed that if anyone confessed him as the Messiah, he would be banned from the synagogue. And this is why his parents said, "He is of age, ask him." So a second time they summoned the man who had been blind and told him, "Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner." He answered, "Whether or not he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know, I was blind, and now I see." And they asked him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" "I already told you," he said, "and you don't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? You don't want to become his disciples too, do you?" And they ridiculed him. "You're the man's disciple, but we're Moses' disciples. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but this man, we don't know where he's from." "This is an amazing thing," the man told them. "You don't know where he's from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God doesn't listen to sinners, but if anyone is God-fearing and does his will, he listens to him. Throughout history, no one has ever heard of someone's eyes being opened, of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he wouldn't be able to do anything." "You were born entirely in sin," they replied, "and you are trying to teach us?" Then they threw him out. Jesus heard that they'd thrown the man out, and he went and found him and asked, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" "Who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?" he asked. Jesus answered, "You have seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking to you." "I believe, Lord," he said, and he worshipped him. Jesus said, "I came into this world for judgment, in order that those who do not see will see, and those who do see will become blind." Some of the Pharisees who were with him heard these things and asked, "We aren't blind too, are we?" "If you were blind," Jesus told them, "you wouldn't have sin. But now that you say, 'We see,' your sin remains."
Has there ever been a time in your life where you thought you were so right? I mean, so right, only to find out at another point in time that you were so wrong. See, this week I've been doing a bit of soul searching, asking myself that very question. Now, most of the time we go through life and we get things wrong, and no one really knows about it. We change our mind on this, we change our mind on that. We get little bits of information and we learn more, and that's fine. That goes on and that carries on. But there are times in our life where that's not the case. So there's times in our life where we think something. We've stumbled across a new discovery and we're so impressed by ourselves that we just have to share it with everybody. And it's only after sharing it with people that we really realise how silly it was. And I'm going to give you a real life example. A few years back, I stumbled across a new extreme sport. It was called liquid mountaineering. Now, if you've never heard of liquid mountaineering, I can understand. It was only practiced by a few skilled and talented athletes. And because of the skill and the physical capability needed, it didn't really take off the ground as a sport. So the idea behind liquid mountaineering was simple. People would wear special liquid-repelling shoes, water-resistant shoes, and when those shoes came in contact with a great athlete, the athlete would be able to run across the water. You know, when I stumbled across this YouTube sensation, I thought to myself that I'd stumbled across something great. And that wasn't until I told my family. See, I was so excited to show them. I thought they're going to think this is really cool. And they obviously weren't as gullible as I was. See, they saw straight through it. They knew as soon as they saw that video that this was a hoax and they were right. But see, what happened was at first I tried to give evidence. I tried to Google this and Google that. Because I thought that this was really real and I wanted to show them that they were wrong and I was right. See, the truth was, in my pride, I wouldn't let it go. In my pride, I didn't want to be wrong. In my pride, I was blind to the truth of what I really saw. And see, although it was a little bit embarrassing to admit that I had been fooled, there's no great harm done. I just become the brunt of future jokes at Christmas parties, and that's fine. I'll wear that. But it does highlight how easily pride can blind us from the truth. And in our passage this morning, that's exactly what we see. We see it in the minds and the hearts of the Pharisees of Jesus' day. See, in their own self-righteous religious pride, they missed their real need for their Saviour. You know, last week we looked at the feeding of the 5,000 and we saw that Jesus doesn't want us to hunger for the things of this world. Rather, he wants us to hunger for him. He wants us to hunger for things of the eternal nature. We discussed the fact that John recorded certain miracles throughout his gospel to highlight certain spiritual lessons. He recorded these miracles to show a deeper truth of who Jesus was, what Jesus had come to do, and the type of kingdom he had come to bring. And behind our story, behind John chapter 9, is another spiritual lesson that we all need to hear. And that brings us to our main point. Jesus is the light of the world who restores spiritual sight to those in darkness. So Jesus is the light of the world who restores spiritual sight to those in darkness. Now, as we come to a chapter like John chapter 9, there's many things you could talk about. There's 41 verses. There's many ways we could break this chapter up. And I was thinking about this week. You know, we could break the chapter up into chunks, looking at the progression of the blind man, seeing Jesus as just a man, then seeing Jesus as just the prophet, and then seeing Jesus as who he really is, the Son of God, the one who'd come to save him. We could break up the passage that way. We could divide the passage up into the conversations that happen. Jesus talking to the blind man, and then the blind man talking to his neighbors, and then the blind man talking to the Pharisees and his family. We could look at the conversations that are happening. But this morning I want us to be thinking about sight. I want us to be thinking about what it really means to see Jesus. I want us to be thinking about spiritual blindness and what it really is. I want us to be thinking about what it means to see our suffering clearly. So I've decided to break the passage up into 4 sections which revolve around this idea of sight and vision. And hopefully they'll be memorable as you think back to John chapter 9 in years to come. So in our passage we see these things. We see the disciples' eyes adjusted, the blind eyes healed, the spiritual eyes opened, and self-righteous eyes condemned. So if you have your Bibles, I do encourage you to have them open at John chapter 9. And parents, if you're here with your kids and you did manage to get a sheet, that's great. But if not, there's some sheets up the back if you want to work through those with your kids. There's some colouring in, there's some note-taking. I encourage them to think, or challenge them to think of one thing that they heard in the sermon this morning, and hopefully it's not my embarrassing story at the start. Okay. So let's look at the first thing that happened. the disciples' eyes adjusted. Suffering is part of our fallen world. It affects us all at some point and in some way. It affects us either firsthand with the loss of a loved one or a close friend. It may be a terminal illness or a freak accident and a tragedy. It may affect us when we see it on the screens of our televisions or when we read about it in the Google or the news.com. See, when we hear of suffering and when we experience suffering, our first reaction is to often ask, why? Why did this happen? Why did these things happen this way? And in questioning, our natural explanations come up and they arise. And this is exactly what we see in the first couple of verses of John chapter 9. So if we turn back to chapter 1, we'll read it again. Verse 1. So in verse 1 it says, "As he was passing by, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, 'Rabbi,' which simply means teacher, 'who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?' Well, neither this man or his parents sinned. This came about so God's work might be displayed in him. Now we must do the works of him who sent me while it was day. Night is coming when no one can work." So when Jesus and the disciples came across this man who'd been blind from birth, we see that the disciples already have an answer. We don't know the age of this man. We don't know how he got to the particular spot he was. We know he's an adult of some type. We pick that up later. And he's blind, and he's been blind from birth, and that's reduced his life to begging. So it's likely that each day he would be taken out or led out to near a temple gate or near a big passageway, and he would beg. All his life, this is all he never ever knew, and he knew what it meant to suffer. Now when they see this man, the disciples ask a pretty straightforward question. Was this man born blind because of his sin, or was this man born blind because of his parents' sin? See, in the disciples' mind, they understood how suffering works. They thought when someone suffers, well, it's in direct relationship with their sin. This formed their worldview of suffering. This gave them the reasons behind the horrors that they see in the world. And I think in most part, that's the default position for most people. Most people generally think that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. Now, before we shake our head and say, no, that's completely wrong, it's generally true in most of our lives. People who make good choices often have a good life. People who make bad choices with their life often have bad things happen to them in life. But not only do we experience this in our own life, we also see something of this in the scriptures. For example, we think of Miriam, the sister of Moses. Miriam's revolt in Numbers chapter 12. Moses is up on a mountainside, and she starts to speak against Moses. And God's anger burns against her, and God strikes her with leprosy. Her sin directly resulted in her suffering. Again, we see it in 1 Corinthians 11. Paul is trying to warn the church at Corinth that they shouldn't take the Lord's Supper in an unworthy manner. 1 Corinthians 11, 29 and 30, he tells the people, whoever eats and drinks without paying regard to the body of Christ, that is the church, he drinks and eats judgment on himself. And this is why many are sick and ill among you. This is the reason why some of you had even died, Paul says. So we see examples in Scripture where someone's sin does result in their suffering. But that's only half the story. See, just as we see cases of individuals suffering because of their sin, we also see cases throughout the Scripture where this is far from the truth. Job. Job is the classic example from the Old Testament. God allows Satan to inflict Job with countless sufferings. He loses his family, he loses his possessions, he loses his health. And his friends come to him and say, Job, you've sinned big time. We know it, we can see it. You've sinned against God, just admit it and die. However, this wasn't the case at all. He underwent great suffering, not because of his sin, but it was the exact opposite. It was because he was an upright and righteous man that he went through his sufferings. Likewise, we see something of this in Paul. He's afflicted with a thorn in his side, not because he had sinned. No, it's because God gave him such great revelations. See, just because something is true, or just because something could be true, it doesn't mean it is true. Just because someone could be suffering, and it could be the case of their sin, this doesn't mean that it's always the case. And this is exactly what Jesus wants to teach his disciples in the next verse. He wants to adjust their eyes to help them see suffering in a different light. He says to them, this man wasn't born blind because of his sin. He wasn't born blind because of the sin of his parents. He was born blind so the works of God could be shown in him. This suffering, the suffering that this man went through, wasn't because of his sin, but it was so God's power could be put on display. And this changes everything. This is the very thing that should set the Christian understand of suffering from the non-Christian understand of suffering. When the world sees suffering, it has few answers. The unbeliever has no purpose in their pain. Life comes, life goes, life carries on. The world say bad things happen, good things happen, that's just life. I'm sure you've seen it. It's very stereotypical, but it's either on the back of a Commodore or the back of a Hilux or tattooed across someone's back. Such is life. The Ned Kelly quote. The world says such is life, but that's not the case for the believer. Jesus looks at his disciples and tells them, you've got this all wrong. This suffering wasn't a result of their sin. This suffering came because God wants to show you just how amazing he is. And brothers and sisters, as I encourage you and I encourage myself, let us not waste our sufferings. Let us not ignore the times in life. They are hard. Suffering hurts. Grief and loss twist our stomach in knots. They reach deep down into our soul and rip out what life we feel we have left. And when we're laying on the floor with nothing else to do, in hopelessness, God says, look to me, the God of hope. This could have come about for his glory. Let us look to the God who says that this could be for his display. So when we get a greater understanding that even the evils of this world can find their purposes in the glory of God, we'll be able to rejoice in God's work no matter what the scenario faces. Jesus had come to do the works of God. He'd come to bring change into the lives of all he came in contact with. And in verse 4, this is what he says. He says, we must do the works of him while it is day. Night is coming and no one can work. He reminds his disciples that his time on earth is short. Jesus' ministry was a short period time. So they should get to work. They must be about doing the business of the one who has sent him. And this is exactly what we see in our next point. Blind eyes healed. You know, as we work our way through the book of John and the miracles of the signs in the book of John, I've mentioned on numerous occasions that he wants to use these miracles as signposts for a greater truth. And so when we get to the healing of the blind man, it should be no surprise that this is going to serve that purpose. It serves to teach us a greater truth. Jesus is going to heal the eyes of the man born blind, and that's going to be a metaphor of how Jesus heals our eyes, our spiritual eyes, which are also born blind. Everyone is born spiritually blind to the truths of God, and it takes a unique work of God and a work of Christ to show us who he really is. So let's have a look at the healing now, and we'll pick up on verse 5. Verse 5 says, as long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. After he said these things, he spit on the ground. He made some mud from the saliva, and he spread the mud on the man's eyes. Go, he told the man, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. And he left, and he washed, and he came back seeing. Now, nothing takes God by surprise. I mean, it certainly takes us by surprise, but nothing takes God by surprise. Everything he does is on purpose and with purpose. And so when we come to Jesus, we also have to have that same thought. Nothing that Jesus does takes him by surprise. Everything that he does on purpose and with a purpose. And so our job as good Bible readers is to think through the purposes and uncover the meaning of why Jesus did and said the things he did. And so what's going on here in John chapter 9? Now I'm sure you've read it before, and I've read before, and thought to yourself, really? Spit? Mud? It's a bit gross. Well, it is gross. There's a million other ways that Jesus could have healed the blind man's eyes, but he chose to use spit and mud. It's gross. Sorry, I just had that there. It's gross, it's gross, it's gross. It's very gross. But The healing of the blind man really is an extraordinary miracle. And Jesus is about to take a man who has never seen his entire life. He's not only going to give him the ability to see, but he's also going to give him the ability to understand and comprehend. He's never seen anything, but he washes his eyes and all of a sudden he can understand everything. But to help us to understand why he used mud and why he used spit, I want us to cast our thoughts back to Genesis. Genesis 1 and 2. See, in the Genesis account of creation, we see something rather amazing when it comes to the creation of man. See, unlike the stars of the sky, unlike the waters of the sea, when God creates man, he stoops down, he takes the dust of the earth, and he molds a man. See, not only does God create a fully functioning human being in this manner, but he also appears to give this man an understanding of the world around him. This ability belongs to God alone. And so when we come to our healing this morning, this is exactly what we see Jesus doing. He spits on the ground. He stoops down. He collects the dust. He rubs it together. And what does he do? He starts to create. Just as God created Adam in the garden out of the dust of the earth, now Jesus is recreating this man who can see out of the dust of the earth. And we'll come to see that not only does Jesus have the power to recreate a broken man physically, but he also has the power to recreate a broken man spiritually. This is his ability alone. When the man comes back from the pool, the miracle sends shockwaves through the neighborhood. He returns and his neighbors come running out, trying to figure out what has happened. And in verse 8 and 9, we see their confusion. Some of them say, "Isn't this the man who used to sit over there? Isn't he that blind beggar? We know his mum and dad." And others, they aren't so convinced. They say, "No, it's not him at all. It only looks like him." And it's at this point we go, maybe their vision isn't so crash hot either. But see, the man who was blind insists, "No, I am that man." And again, it shows us something of what happens when someone becomes a Christian. People start to look at you as if you're the old person, but you act differently, you speak differently, you think differently, and this is exactly what happened to the man. They couldn't even recognize him. And so they say in verse 10, well, how did this happen? In verse 11, he tells him, "You wouldn't believe it. I was sitting over there where I usually sit, and I was begging as I usually beg, and people were giving as they usually gave. And I heard a conversation off in the distance. People were questioning why I was born this way. And I started thinking to myself, well, yeah, why was I born this way? That was a very interesting question. Then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, these hands were on me. Someone started rubbing mud in my eyes. I couldn't see him, but they started rubbing mud in my eyes. I didn't know who it was, but I heard that his name was Jesus. He told me to go wash in the pool, so I had to go wash in the pool. So I went and I washed the mud from my eyes, and now all of a sudden, I started noticing the world around me. I started to see people. I saw buildings, I saw water, I saw the temple. I saw the place where I used to sit and beg, and now I'm standing in front of you, and I can see you." His neighbors, still confused and a bit of shock, they answer and they say to him, "Well, where is this man? Where is this person called Jesus?" By this time, he had left the place. So they did the only thing that made sense to them. They took the man to the Pharisees. Now, our whole story in verse 14 comes to a halt. In verse 14, we find out that the day that Jesus made mud was a Sabbath. And in the eyes of the self-righteous religious Pharisees, this was a no-no. It was in these next verses that we really begin to see who was the blind person in our story. You know, yes, the blind man couldn't see the world around him, but the truth is the Pharisees couldn't see the work of the Lord in front of them. If you remember back to John chapter 5, we saw this problem before. And Jesus comes to the pool of Bethesda. He heals a man who's been lame for 38 years. The man picks up his mat as he's been told. And the first thing that the Pharisees say is, "Why are you carrying that mat?" They were blind to the very fact of what happened. Their piety, their religiousness, their self-righteous blinded them to the fact of who Jesus really was. And it's happening again in our passage this morning. The blind man has his eyes open, and Jesus, in an act of recreation, has not only given him eyes that work, but also a mind that comprehends the world around him. And this miracle points to the real miracle which is happening in the background. The man is actually having his spiritual eyes open, and that's what we see. and spiritual eyes open. You know, when someone comes to Christ, the early weeks of their Christianity, the early months of their newfound faith, are crucial to their faith. They're like newborn babies who are trying to find their way around in life. And new believers are often faced with a number of hurdles, obstacles that they're going to need to navigate and jump over and work through to grow in their faith. And that's what we see in our story with the blind man this morning. As we work through the next section, we learn something extremely important about what it means to follow Christ. We'll see this new disciple of Jesus, disowned by his family, ridiculed and mocked by the Pharisees, and eventually kicked out of his one safety net, the synagogue. But by the end of it, we see that he was willing to pay the price. He was willing to pay these costs. And the reason why is because he had a first-hand encounter with his healer and his redeemer. In verse 15, the Pharisees ask, "How did you receive your sight?" And he tells them the story again. "Well, I was over there, I was begging, and people were talking to me, and all of a sudden, bam, right in my eyes, there was this mud. And then I had to go and wash, and when I washed, and I came back, I could see." Now, the Pharisees were faced with a dilemma. And in verse 16, our problem plays out in front of them. There are those on one side of the court, saying that, well, he's broken one of our rules, so therefore he must be a sinner, and he couldn't have done these things. And then on the other side of the court, there's those who say, well, we know that guy, he was blind and he's healed, and he said that this Jesus did it, what do we do? Now, not knowing how to come to an agreement, they turn back to the man. Well, who is it that healed you? Well, he's a prophet. At this stage, that's the only reasonable answer that the man can give. He must be a prophet. Thinking back to Moses, thinking back to Elijah, thinking back to Elisha. He's probably thinking of the story in 2 Kings 5 of Naaman and Elijah. Naaman, the Assyrian general, the commander, he comes and he says, I need to be healed. What's wrong? I've got leprosy. He says, there's a little slave girl in his town and says, you know what, there's a man. He lives in Israel. He's a prophet. His name's Elijah and he can heal you. So Naaman charges off trying to get his healing. Elijah turns around and says, you know what, go wash in the Jordan 7 times. And Naaman in his pride says, I'm not washing in the Jordan River. I'm not going to do that. Eventually, he does do that. And what happens? He's healed. So the blind man must be thinking something like, well, he must be a prophet like Elijah. The Pharisees hear the story and they don't accept it. So they bring his parents in. And in verse 19, we see their interaction. Verse 9, it says, "Is this your son, the one who was born blind? How does he now see?" "Look, we know that this is our son, and we know that he was born blind," his parents answered. "But we don't know how he sees. We don't know who opened his eyes. Ask him. He's of age. He will speak for himself." Now his parents said these things because they were afraid of the Jews, since the Jews had already agreed if anyone confesses the Messiah, they would be banned from the synagogue. And this is why his parents said, "Ask him. He is of age." Now the parents, out of fear, didn't want to mention the name of Jesus. They knew if they gave credit to Jesus, they would be out of the synagogue. They would lose their safety net and their social status. So not wanting to pay the price for suffering for Christ, they throw their son under the bus. So now the son knows if he continues to follow Christ, he'll do so without the support of his closest family, his mother and his father. Now he's going to undergo the ridicule and mockery of the Pharisees. The Pharisees start to ramp up their questioning to him, trying to get him to deny the truth of what was really going on, but he wouldn't budge. They remind him that Jesus made mud on the Sabbath. It's clear that he's a sinner. Don't give glory to him, give glory to God. And in verse 25, he tells him, as plain as they can, you know what, you can say what you want about him, but all I know is I was blind, but now I see. And so they try to get him to retell his story, and you can see it. They try to get him to retell his story, catch him out in a detail here, catch him out of the detail there. And the man who is now a self-identified disciple of Jesus throws the questions back to them. In a move which can only be seen as Holy Spirit boldness, the man questions them and says, "Do you want to be his disciple too?" With a little twist of sarcasm there. And this, of course, upsets them. and they begin to mock him and ridicule him. We're disciples of Moses, they say. Everybody knows Moses. He's the most famous of all the prophets of God, and we know that God spoke to Moses. You may think this Jesus character is a prophet, but no one knows him. Where is he from? And the conversation goes back and forth like a year 5 playground squabble. It's like two kids facing off with the strong dad test. You know, one kid says, yeah, well, my dad's so strong, he can carry a car. And then the other kid across responds to him and he says, yeah, well, my dad's so strong, he can carry a car while it's parked in our garage, while he's carrying the house. And the conversation ends. The Pharisees, in the ultimate move of immaturity, slander the man of his upbringing. And they say to him, you are entirely born in sin, and you're trying to teach us? Get out of our synagogue. The man was disowned by his mother and his father. His mother and his father, because he wanted to follow Christ. He was ridiculed and mocked by the Pharisees because of his desire to follow Christ. And now he's been kicked out of the synagogue on the account of Christ. But none of these seem to faze him. And we're left asking why. Why would these things not bother the man? Well, it's because Jesus has opened his physical eyes, but he's also opened his spiritual eyes. Now, Jesus heard that he'd been thrown out of the synagogue, and he searches to find him. And in verse 35, Jesus questions the man, wanting to test his faith one more time. He says to the man, do you believe in the Son of Man? A reference back to Daniel chapter 7. He says, do you believe in the one that's coming down from heaven? Do you believe in the one who has been given all dominion and all power and all glory and all authority? Do you believe in the one who has come to bring an everlasting kingdom, one that will never pass away, one that will never be destroyed? And the man replies, well, yes, I do believe in him. Do you know who he is? And Jesus says, well, in fact, I am him. Jesus reveals that the fact that he is the Lord and God of this man's life, and he falls down and worships him. He says, I believe, and he worshipped him. Now, brothers and sisters, can I encourage you, it's quite possible that following Christ may cost us the love and support of our family members, of our friends. We may lose credibility among our peers. It may cost us friendships in our schoolyards. It may even get to the point in society where it may cost us our freedoms. But when the world rejects us, even when our family rejects us or our family's our friends, we can be assured that Jesus Christ will not reject us. Jesus will never, ever turn us away. See, the man had lost everything. Jesus opened his eyes to the truth of who he really was, and he was welcomed into the family of God. Just as Jesus opened his physical eyes so he could see clearly the world around him, now Jesus had opened his spiritual eyes so he could see that following Jesus was far more important than the things of this world. And as we come to our last point, we come to a pointy end which comes with a warning. And it's a word of warning that we all must hear. See, the last thing we see in our passage is self-righteous eyes condemned. Self-righteous eyes condemned. Now, I don't know about you, but for me personally, there can be nothing more repulsive, nothing more, just frustrating and icky than a prideful person. See, when we come in contact with prideful people, we feel it. They think they're always right. They're never wrong. They always need to be the center of the conversation, and they can't seem to understand anything from anyone's perspective. The prideful person sees everything only from one perspective, and that's their own. See, when you spend time with a prideful person, you get this angst which builds up inside of you. You get a frustration and anger, and it just makes you feel like you want to pop. Prideful people leave a disgusting taste in our mouths. But that's not the biggest issue. The biggest issue is that pride often blinds its victims to the very fact that they are prideful. And so it becomes something very easy to highlight in someone else's life, but something extremely hard to highlight in our own lives. So we're left with the question of going, well, how can I stop myself from falling prey to pride? How can I stop myself from this sin which seems to so easily grip people without them even knowing? And the only way we can escape this sin, the only remedy that we can employ against our own pride, is to allow the truth and light of Jesus to shine in our lives. And this is what Jesus tells the man that he has come to do. In our few final verses, they end with a sobering reminder that those who claim to see are often the blindest of the lot. And it's a reminder that those who boast in themselves and in their own achievements are often those who have blinded themselves to the truths of who they really and honestly are before God. And more importantly, who Jesus is. And so we read in verse 39 through 41, and Jesus said, I have come into this world for judgment, in order that those who do not see, in order that those who do not see will see, and those who do see will become blind. Now some of the Pharisees who were there heard him say these things and asked, we aren't blind too, are we? And Jesus replied to them, if you were blind, you wouldn't have sin. But you say, we see, so your sin remains. Jesus tells the man that he had come into the world for judgment. The light that he was going to shine was going to judge between those who were actually blind and those who claimed to see. But how does Jesus do this? Simply by exposing our deeds for what they really are. See, Jesus is the only one who's able to shed light on our life and expose our true need before God. When we are judged by his standard, we are always found to miss the target. See, the only thing that can stop a person seeing their own faults at the light of Jesus is their own pride. It's the person who claims that they're all okay. It's the person who claims that they've got this God thing sorted. It's the person who claims that they don't need Christ are the very ones who are blinded to their own pride. It's the man so blinded by his self-righteousness that he'll never see his need for a perfect Saviour. And this describes the Pharisees in our story this morning. Some of the Pharisees say, when he speaks of judgment, they say, we aren't blind too, are we? And with a profound sense of irony in the whole story, Jesus said, if you were blind, you wouldn't be guilty of your sin. But the issue is, you claim that you see, so your sin remains. In other words, it would be better off if you were blind, but you were so prideful. You were so sure of yourself. So you claim to be leaders of people in all truth. You claim to be disciples of Moses. A chapter ago, you claim to be descendants of the great Abraham. You claim that you've got this all together, but because of your claim, you remain in your sin. Until you actually realize how blind you are, there is no hope for you. And it's a sad ending to a long chapter. It highlights how pride blinds people from the truth of their need of Christ. But it also ends with us having to ask some questions of our own lives. Questions like, do I claim to see, but the truth is I don't? Do I claim to be a Christian? But if I'm honest, I'm not. Do I claim or do I wear the religious name tag? But if I'm honest, I can't remember the last time I even prayed to God. Do I sit in church ticking the boxes, doing the right things at the right time, saying the right things at the right time? But the truth is, I've never really understood my need for Jesus at all. And if you're sitting in this room and you think that way, you may be fooling us, but you're not fooling him. If it describes you, I don't sit up here with a big stick. I don't. But I warn you with what the scripture says. This is the same position the Pharisees found themselves in. Claiming to be wise, they were fools. Claiming to see, they were blind. So I beg you, turn from your foolishness and come to Christ. Turn from your foolishness, turn from your hypocrisy, and turn to the one who can forgive. Show your need of Christ. Now, I said it earlier and I said it again, and it's still up there. The only remedy against our pride, the only remedy against our self-righteousness, the only remedy against trying to win heaven on our own merits is to allow the truth and the light of Jesus to shine on the dark recesses of our life. We must come to him humbly realizing that we are blind and it's he who can make us see. This morning we started our sermon with a big question. There's a question that I asked myself and I asked you. I said, has there ever been a time in your life where you thought you were so right about something to only find out that you were so wrong? I shared an embarrassing story and we all laughed and giggled, and that was fine. But now as we come to the end of our sermon, we ask the same question, but in a more serious manner. Have you claimed to see Jesus correctly, but the truth is you haven't? Have you claimed to be living a holy life, but the truth is you don't? Have you claimed to be a leader in righteousness, but the truth is you're not? This morning is a chance to stop that. This morning is a chance to let the truth and the light of Christ shine in your life and expose yourself before him. Brothers and sisters, let me encourage you. The only person who can give us eyes to see is the Lord Jesus Christ himself. We must turn to him as our Lord and Saviour and let him expose our lives. How about we pray? Our gracious God, we thank you for your word. I do ask that you would go before your word and you would do works in our hearts. Lord God, we remember that we are born blind. Help us to remember that without you, we are hopeless beggars, scurrying around in the dark. Father, help us not be blinded by our own pride. Help us not to be blinded by our own self-righteousness. Help us to allow the light of Christ to shine in our life and expose our human deeds for what they really are, nothing. We come to you because you're a gracious God who sent a gracious Son to die on our behalf. And we pray that our hearts will be softened before you. In Christ's name, amen.